Hey everyone. All right, that took me a few more minutes than I thought. They did this thing where they started downloading a new version and they pushed that. Like when you bring up the streaming software, if they have a new version, they just, boom, you're going to download it now. And I'm like, not now. I'm trying to get on to. Read aloud. Okay. I'm putting the link in the chat right now. Whenever I say that, I always hear Lincoln. I'm putting Lincoln in the chat. Lincoln. Abraham? Whoa. Did I do it twice? Better check it before I wreck it. Oh, that looks good. Okay. Cool. Let's go. It's a long one. It's good. Thank you all 5 of you for being here. Do not get hit. I met Aki, as I'll call him here, on a corner in Midtown Manhattan. He had been walking just in front of me, and I had been watching him because I was sure I could tell who he was, but I didn't know his name yet or his personal identity. But I could tell who he was. He was wearing a business suit and he was carrying 3 small books, which he held in one hand at his side. I could see them clearly. A New York guidebook, an English language text, one of those popular generic ones, and a plastic laminated book with thin pages whose edge was in shiny gold, the imperative little translation dictionary that Asians everywhere called a concise translation. This was a young businessman from Japan, is what I saw. By his appearance, he had recently graduated from a superfine college, passed all the necessary exams for employment in one of Japan's substantial and growing companies, and had been assigned a job in the United States. He had been in this country just a few months, and at most of all, he had to improve his English. Many years in Asia and my close acquaintance with literally dozens of Koreans, Chinese, Japanese students had taught me to recognize who was who. I had become familiar with the lifestyle patterns that they so carefully maintain. I could now identify nationality from just even posture and the way they walked and dressed, and books told me the rest. So he's saying he could tell if you were from China or Korea or Japan just by some clues. When we came to the corner, and they're very significantly different, when we came to the corner, we both stopped to wait for the traffic light. And I turned to him and I spoke. Where are you from? I felt reasonable doing this. I had not been in the city much longer than he, and I suppose having quite recently spent a lot of time in Seoul, Korea, I felt rather kind of like a foreigner myself in New York City. Besides, I had been spoken to by strangers hundreds of times in the streets and alleys of Japan and Korea, so now people wanted to practice their English. So sometimes youngsters came running behind me and they said, wait, wait. Sometimes students wearing watches would ask me the time just so they could practice the English. Sometimes people would hope I was lost, and when convinced I was not lost, they would claim I was lost and they were going to help me just so they could practice their English. Once in an elevator in Seoul, I listened to 2 shy high school students urge one another in Korean to try their English on me. I finally told them in their own Korean language that I had passed my floor to help them out. And if one of them didn't eventually talk first, we were going to go up and down in this elevator all day. So anyway, I felt fine asking him, where are you from? I am from Japan, Aki answered. I know, but where in Japan? He named a place I didn't recognize, and I told him I had been to Japan several times. I'd been to Tokyo and Yokohama. This place, he explained, was midway between those 2 cities. He had been living in Tokyo for the past several years while attending university, and now he worked for a Nissan Motor Company. When the light changed, we both started across, and he asked where I was going. We were both walking to the same destination we discovered, to an international visitor center a few blocks away. I was to meet a Korean friend, and he was trying to get hotel accommodations. It was this coincidence that led to our immediate acquaintance and our eventual friendship. My Korean friend was late, and Aki and I sat and talked for more than an hour in the Friendship Center. Since I knew such little Japanese, he attempted to give me some lessons right there. This Aki would never be a typical businessman. I thought He seemed too quiet, too reserved. He wasn't weak or he wasn't shy. He used a kind of gentleness that I had seen in monks and religious people. I memorized a few new Japanese words, and then Aki decided to chart out the entire hiragana syllable system so I'd have some worthwhile homework. I still have that alphabet written on a napkin to this day. And on the other side is the hotel address that Aki acquired while we were there at the center. That office, it turned out, gave discount certificates for certain New York hotels to certain foreign visitors. I learned about Aki's situation that day. Soon after his employment at Nissan, Aki had been sent to the United States. He was going to be a Datsun engineer representative, but this first year was to be an orientation. For 12 months, he would have very few company duties and plenty of time to develop fluency in English and familiarity with American life. He had been here 2 months now, and it was not working. He felt his uncle was a successful businessman with a huge home in Queens, New York, and Aki was given a room there. He was living with his uncle, his aunt, and a few cousins, and occasionally a guest or two, but nobody spoke English in the household. It was like being in Japan, except in Queens. The food, the conversation, everything. So he thought by checking into a hotel, he would get in the middle of American life. I wonder what would come of this new arrangement. Aki was provided a room in a transient hotel in the middle of Times Square, a very questionable place to be hanging out. I thought, learn about these life in the United States. I promised to keep the napkin, study hiragana, and visit him. More than 2 weeks passed, though, before I was able to make it to Times Square to call on Aki. So Times Square is a huge tourist destination, but at night, it's not safe. And it's definitely not representative of America or New York life, quite frankly. Much happened to him, though, in those 2 weeks. I got the whole story sitting in a restaurant next to the hotel. Perhaps I was more eager to hear it than he was to tell it, quite frankly. But in any case, I questioned him persistently. And I listened to him patiently until all that had been said and done by him and to him. For the first few days, Aki had walked up and down the streets trying to talk to anyone and everyone. In Times Square, not a great thing to do. That almost never worked, but when it did, he soon had reason to regret it. So Aki tried the old folks who sat in the lobby of his hotel. He made friends with one older lady who was always knitting. For the next few days, he conversed with this lady. He heard about her hometown, how she had moved to New York, and about her husband had passed away. He could not understand every word she said, but he was practicing English, and it was also company. It was easy to meet her. She was always sitting in the same place and knitting in the same place, but this too somehow went wrong. She inquired about Aki and what he was doing there. She eventually had to hear about Nissan Motors and the Datsun exports. Her response was instantly and starting. Why, you little so-and-so, cars were developed in America. We had them from the beginning. The only way you could make cars in Japan was to copy us. You people come over here today to copy us, and then you try to sell it back to us. No wonder why we call you bad names. Aki listened to those remarks and then politely excused himself. After that, when he passed her in the lobby, she didn't want to talk to him anymore. There was also a young married couple from Pakistan. Aki went and visited their room a few times, but they always talked in Pakistani, making huge gaps in the conversation. One day he noticed, though, just right to the information desk, a little sign that said information. This, he thought, might be the answer. Please tell me, where do you have standard American people? That's funny. Where do you have standard American people? Not in Times Square. He asked the man, look up Times Square, and you'll see what I mean. He asked the man behind the sign, but the man didn't understand his question. It was difficult to explain. Aki decided, I want to see American families having a picnic. He said, go to Central Park. and he set out immediately for another very unfortunate adventure. Okay, so when this book was written in the late 70s, early 80s, when it takes place, New York is at its highest crime rate. And Central Park, even in the daytime, parts of it are not safe. I grew up, I know. Like, you could go to parts of Central Park, but then there were parts of Central Park you did not go. Yeah. Because the crime was high in New York in the late 70s. It's gotten a lot better. It's totally different now. When he reached Central Park, he wanted to walk for nearly an hour, decided he should go back to his hotel, and then return again tomorrow in the daytime. It was starting to get dark. But suddenly there were 6 men standing in front of him. They seemed to have come from nowhere, and they said, "Give us your money," one shouted. Aki stood quietly. 2 men walked behind him, and one gave him a shove. "Give us your money. Give us your watch." There was one more shove. Then the 2 men held his arms while another removed his watch, and they were off. Aki found a policeman just outside the park and decided to say something for the sake of others. He had expected the policeman to be alarmed at the surprise he knew, but they just looked at him like this thing happened every day. In fact, he said so. This does happen in Central Park every day. It happens every day? It happens every day, he said to him. "You're not from New York, are you?" "Well, don't be going in Central Park anymore. You're just asking for trouble when you do. They go in bunches, they get bicycles and everything that way. You come out of here after it's too late. What am I supposed to do?" The policeman said to him. So it was back to the sidewalks of Times Square for Aki. I just want to say, as a New Yorker, Aki has picked literally the worst time in history and the worst places that are completely not representative of really what New York or America is to try to find his ordinary American people. Still not a single American friend, though, came his way. More than once he was approached by someone wanting to sell him a watch. He supposed they were street vendors who had not noticed that he didn't have one. That's what they thought. Then one young vendor explained about hot goods. And Aki had an English lesson on stolen property. Once he even thought he saw his own watch, but he said nothing. I promised Aki that I would start visiting him every day, and I did. We went to restaurants, we went to theaters. We rode boats and subways and elevators, and we saw the Empire State Building, and we also saw the Statue of Liberty and all the fabulous sights of New York. America was looking better now to Aki, and Aki was looking happier to me. But I remembered his having inquired after the whereabouts of standard American people. Isn't that funny? Standard American people. "Things are going to get better for you," I told him. "You'll see. In time, you'll get to meet lots of American friends and families. You'll go to picnics and parties and everything." Somehow I thought there had to be a change in his situation. But his uncle's place had not been a good place to learn about America. But this hotel in Times Square was not good either. Okay, just looking at the pages. I had a sister and a brother-in-law who lived in Brooklyn. They had 2 young children and were part of a commune family. This commune was purchasing a 3-story house and 50 acres way up in the country a few hours north of New York City in the Catskills Mountain. It had previously been a guest resort for hunters, but they were going to make it into a commune. And in order that all the grown-ups and children could experience a sharing lifestyle in a natural setting. I had once been there for the weekend. Soon everyone would be heading up for a 3-week stay, and I was invited. This was actually not a standard situation or even standard people, but it occurred to me it would be useful and a reassuring experience for Aki. So I consulted with everybody and got back to Aki, and the matter was arranged. Aki checked out of his hotel, and we moved into a room under the front porch of this huge New England-style house way a few hours north of New York City in the Catskills in the mountains. It was a charming place, and I supposed Aki had never seen anything like it. The tall wooden house with its gables and porches and balconies, the long stony walkway that led to the front gate, the wooded hills rising behind. It was so beautiful. A sparkling pond fed by a babbling brook and adorned by a little wooden bridge that looked like a rainbow in shape. Ducks waddling on the green grass. All this blended together to create a storybook atmosphere that was amazing and enchanted all of us. Very different than Times Square, New York City. People wanted to move up here for good, and part of the purpose of the 3-week stay, except for Aki and me, was to explore how to make this setup work. The place was barely a full day's drive from New York City, easy enough for a stay like this, but it was too far to drive back and forth to work. The question of how to live in a place like this where the lifestyle seemed so real and yet unreal. Aki and I sometimes listened to the meetings in which people discussed farming and dairy farming and ranching and cottage crafts and all these ideas that seemed feasible for achieving freedom from their city jobs. I explained to Aki that there was a number of groups now exploring this communal living and that this was part of the evolution of new culture in our country, that I thought it was good for him to see a standard, though I thought it was not. So this is probably early 70s, his recollection. So this book was put together in the 80s. He's probably remembering the early 70s when there was still that 1960s commune thing going on. Aki related best with kids. There were 10 of them, and they aged from 6 to 16. They all different in their wants and ways, but they all competed for Aki's time and attention. There were 4 sets of parents and 3 other adults, Aki and I, and Bonnie. Bonnie was a woman in her 20s who was either laughing or singing every moment. Her laugh was overpowering, and her singing was delightful and engaging. She was everyone's friend, and she and her guitar were always invited. Aki found her a little scary at first, it seemed to me, but her singing was easy and pleasing to him. And she also liked hugs. Her loud laugh rang out through the hills and the woods and made even the ducks scatter. This is not seen in Japan, such a thing. In a manner most pure and natural to herself, she tried to make up for any coldness Aki might have experienced in our country. But to Aki, and by Japanese standards, she was overwhelming and overzealous. In her hugs and her loudness and all that stuff. Up over the hills to the east, about 15 minutes drive of winding dirt roads, there was a pond that was 50 times as large as this one. In ours, you could dip in and get wet, but this bigger pond, you could swim or dive off a rock in the center, and you could lie on the sand in the sun. People called this place the swimming hole, and they came from miles around. It wasn't crowded because there were never many people from miles around. 8 of us piled into the old pickup one afternoon to take Aki to the swimming hole. It was his first swim since he had left the country, and he appeared to have been missing it, for he was the first to run splashing into the water, even with the fastest kids behind him. Soon he had swum the whole pond and was standing at the shallow end, shaking his head so that shiny drops of water flew through the air. Someone shouted in the middle, "Is that some Japanese person?" I heard someone shout. "What?" I shouted back in an equally loud voice. The sound had simply burst out. 2 paunchy men in the middle of the pond, sitting on a large rock. One of them was with a girl who was likely the daughter of one. The man said, "Is that someone there Japanese?" He shouted again. I glanced at Aki. He was floating on his back. He looked like he hadn't heard. One of his children answered proudly that yes, his friend was indeed from Japan. "Get him out of our swimming hole." Bonnie walked around the edge of the pond and swam up to the rock. "Can I come up on the island?" she called in a cheerful voice. Remember, Bonnie, the overzealous one. Without waiting for a response, she climbed up the rock and plumped herself down in front of the others. And there was barely room for all of them to sit. And Bonnie clasped one man's hand for balance. Then she removed her top and flung it into the water and just sunned with not all of her clothes. The sun's fantastic here. The 2 men grabbed their daughter, scampered down the rock, splashed to the shore, jumped in their car, and just drove off. When the car was out of sight, everyone just looked at Bonnie. For a moment, she sat up on the top and folded her arms over the chest, looking very pleased but kind of embarrassed. Then she dove into the water and retrieved her clothes. 3 or 4 minutes had passed from this insult to the exit. I thought this was one of the most interesting examples of nonviolent, non-confrontational defense I had ever seen. I believe Aki thought so too. I believe he had really understood the whole affair, but he never mentioned it. None of us ever talked about it again, though it was later discussed because Bonnie wanted the children to know about racism and to hear the reasons for why that unusual behavior happened. But the next time I saw those two hugging, I knew it was Aki's idea. One day, Bonnie fell off a bike in the gravel driveway out front, and she injured her head badly. Some friends who were there passing through had driven her and the bike 10 miles up the highway, and I left her there to enjoy the exhilarating downhill coast back home, but she was going like really fast, like 30 miles an hour, when she turned onto a gravel drive and hit the front wheel brake. Aki heard the thump and went running. Her head was not looking good, and we thought she had a concussion. There were no vehicles at the moment, and all we could do was wait. I called a dairy farmer who lived down the road, and he came speeding with a cloud of dust. We piled into the car and headed for the doctor. Aki held a towel around Bonnie's head. We spent the rest of the day obtaining confirmation that there was no concussion, nothing broken, nothing out of place, but she was bruised and scratched. She could recuperate at home. Over the next few days, I watched Aki care for Bonnie. He examined her cuts and bruises. He cleaned her scalp and her face with warm towels, massaged her neck and shoulders. This was a simple, unassuming friendship that they had found, but I could feel they had come to share a sort of deep empathy. Our days were full. Time passed, and Aki was the first to mention one evening that we had but one more day in this place. After dishes, most of the parents and kids left for an overnight trip up north to attend some business related to the property. Bonnie and I sat in the kitchen and talked about Aki. We wonder what would come of his life in our country over the months and years ahead. We wondered what he was going to do now when he went back to the city. We felt it unlikely he would ever be back here, and Bonnie wondered where, when, and whether she might actually ever even see him again. We decided to play a trick on Aki. How that thought arose, I'm not sure either, but some of us decided to play a trick, and we spent a long time arriving at the perfect idea. It was supposed to be a dumping pail trick. Before Aki should come wandering up the room downstairs, we braced a board across a 2-foot gap in a slightly open door and balanced a full bucket of water on top so it would fall on Aki when he came through the door. This is getting really weird, isn't it? Perhaps we thought this was another example of life in America. A trick unheard of in Japan. No doubt something Aki would take back with him in his bag of memories. In any case, it was fun setting up our trick, and Bonnie was giggling as she sent me downstairs to fetch Aki. As I entered the room, I saw him standing in the mirror before a pan of water. "Why are you shaving in here?" I asked. In fact, why are you in shaving this time of night? "I need it. This is every man's have-to-do thing." "Well, anyway, Bonnie wants to see you. She asked me to get you." "Okay. Now we know my shaving reason. I better use this." From his pack, he smelled a ball bottle with a Japanese label, and it was some kind of aftershave of cologne, and he put it on his cheeks and said, "Let's go." So we ascended the steps to the side porch, and I glanced slightly through the open door. I almost started laughing, but Bonnie had planted herself in a folding chair squarely in front of the upcoming scene. I knew there was a stifled whoop behind the hand she held over her face, and I realized the need for an instant strategy. As I was slightly older than my Japanese friend, he was always last in every one at a time situation. Now he had to walk in before me. I stopped as though to tie my shoe and motioned him on. "Aki, come here," she said with a laugh. In a moment it was over. Aki stood in the doorway, drenched in water. The bucket dumped himself on the target and rolled across the floor. Bonnie held tight to the seat of her chair and had such a ferocious laugh, the whole chair rocked and the house seemed to shake. Aki looked shocked and ashamed. He stood motionless for a long moment, his clothes dripping, and then he said, "No good." Instantly, I felt an awful rush of guilt. Why had we even done this cruel and puzzling thing to our gentle foreign friend? I'm asking myself that too. I could not think of anything to say, and Bonnie also felt it. Her expression changed from glee to utter pain. And she hugged him. So Aki suddenly laughed. No, no, no. No wet hugging. If you need water, go get your own. I'll help you. No wet hugging. Wet hugging is too liberal. And he went downstairs to change his clothes. We cleaned up the mess. What do you suppose he thinks of us now? I told her I wasn't sure, and beyond those words, we were silent. Bonnie and I cleaned up our mess. Oh, when I went down to join Aki, he said, I'm sorry, Aki, we shouldn't have done that. I guess we thought it'd be another American experience for you, but it was really stupid. We're really sorry. That was not good. Really not good. I hope you try it again. For a moment, we were both really puzzled. Did that mean my apology was insufficient and I should try my apology again? But he went on, next time you try, you please try something different. Same thing again is too easy. Try anything. Maybe throw something at my back. Now I know I am no good in these days. In America, I lost everything. What are you talking about, Aki? I made a mistake. You saw me? I got wet. Aki, it was a trick. It was supposed to happen. Yeah, trick. I understand trick, but I missed, said Aki. I should catch it. You could never catch it, Aki. A tipping bucket full of water? You can't catch it. It's not your fault. It's our fault. We shouldn't have done it. Fault, nobody's fault. Only my fault, said Aki. This is my training. You don't know. First mistake, I feel nothing. So I got in the door. Second mistake, I do nothing. So I got wet. I'm not quick. I've lost all my speed. No good. He shook his head again. If my teacher would see this... And he stopped himself. I watched him for a moment, and it started to come together. I had met a couple of martial arts trainers in Asia. Really great, talented people. They were extremely quiet and gentle. They were like Aki. They could nearly fly. Now it fit. I recalled the scene from several days earlier, the scene I had dismissed as a mistaken impression. I was sitting in the living room to talking one of the mothers while Aki was playing with the children outside. All afternoon, he had been teaching them a kind of tumbling, so we could hear their happy cheers. I looked out the window. I thought I saw Aki fly past the window as he leapt as high as the eaves of the porch roof. It was unlikely. The main floor was 2 stories up from the ground level. Laura was facing me, and she simply went on talking. And then I realized it was actually true. Aki, what training? What teacher? Aki said nothing. He stood up and he walked outside. I waited a moment to follow, and I wanted to be thoughtful. I wanted to pursue this. We sat by the little bridge that went over the brook. The bubbling water and the singing crickets all made a pleasant sound, and then it started slowly. Aki talked as though he had never talked before. He had black belts in judo, karate, and aikido. And he was an adept of the highest degree in a few other disciplines whose names were not even familiar to me. He had been a student of martial arts from childhood. His life had been devoted to strict and steady discipline. At one point in our conversation, I somehow remembered his episode in Central Park. I said, wait a minute, Aki. What about that watch? How come you lost your watch in Central Park that day? There were 6. 6 is too many. Wait a minute. I've watched martial arts movies. I've seen one single guy fight 6, and he put his fingers over my lips and prevented me from going on. It was an unusual gesture for Aki. He sat there with his hand on my face, staring at me quietly, as though my understanding should come through silence. But he allowed me an explanation. He literally whispered, and I had to strain to hear him. For the first time since I've met Aki, I was fully aware of Aki's immense strength and for composure. For the first time, I started to look up to him. Okay, we are halfway in this story, and it unfolds much, much more. So I'm going to read the rest tomorrow, because we're already over time. Okay, I will see you guys at 10:45. Thank you.